For decades, Helen Keller's childhood home in Tuscumbia, Alabama, known as Ivy Green, has stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. But beyond the neatly manicured grounds and glowing tributes lies another story. One the docents don't tell. A story of shadows that linger long after the crowds leave. It started with a chilling discovery in the summer of 1994. Sarah Grayson, a graduate student researching Keller's life, was granted after-hours access to the house. She had always admired Keller, and walking through the very halls where the deafblind icon learned her first words was both a privilege and an inspiration. Yet, from the moment Sarah entered the home alone, unease prickled her skin. It wasn't the preserved furniture or the sepia photographs staring back from the walls, it was the silence. The kind of silence that feels alive. While paging through an old ledger in Helen's bedroom, Sarah heard the faint tap-tap-tap of fingers brushing against wood. She froze, her heart thudding in her ears. The noise came from the far corner of the room, where a small wooden desk sat. Nothing moved. Telling herself it was the house settling, she resumed her work, only for the taps to return, this time sharper, rhythmic, unmistakably deliberate. It was Morse code. Sarah wasn't fluent, but she recognized the distress call SOS. Bolting from the room, she raced downstairs to the parlor. The house's caretaker, Dale Morgan, had warned her about the quirks of Ivy Green but hadn't elaborated. Now she wished she'd pressed him for details. Over coffee the next morning, Dale reluctantly shared the darker side of Helen Keller's legacy. "You know, Helen's family didn't always support her education," Dale began. "Her father, Captain Keller, wasn't the saint people think. There were disagreements, fights, especially when her brother, James, got involved." Dale's voice lowered. "James was different. Angry. Some say violent. Folks around here believe he resented Helen and, well, some claim his spirit never left." Sarah shivered, remembering the tapping. But why would he use Morse code? James was a cadet before the war. Taught himself Morse for signaling. Funny thing, though, he wasn't the only one. Helen used to practice it with her teacher, Miss Sullivan. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the tapping was meant for her. On her final night at Ivy Green, Sarah decided to stay late again, determined to debunk the ghost story. She brought a tape recorder and a notebook, convinced she could document the strange sounds and find a logical explanation. The evening was quiet at first, the humid Alabama air pressing against the house like a living thing. Around midnight, the tapping resumed, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. SOS. Sarah sat at the desk, her hands trembling. She placed her fingers against the smooth wood and whispered, "Who's there?" The reply wasn't verbal. The desk vibrated faintly, as if someone was tapping directly beneath it. The pattern changed, short bursts followed by long pauses. She scribbled the sequence in her notebook and later translated it. The message was chilling. "Help her." Her throat tightened. "Help who?" Suddenly, the air turned icy. A shadow moved across the room, not cast by any person or object. The shadow moved with purpose, gliding toward the doorway. Sarah followed, clutching her flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark hallway, landing on the cellar door, which now stood ajar. It hadn't been open earlier. The cellar at Ivy Green was rarely mentioned in tours. It was a cramped, damp space that Helen herself had supposedly hated. But now it seemed to call to Sarah, its gaping maw daring her to descend. She stepped carefully down the creaking stairs. The smell of earth and mildew was overpowering. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed a crude stone wall with jagged scratches etched across its surface. They weren't random. They formed letters. "Find her." Her breath hitched as a faint moan echoed through the cellar. She swung the flashlight wildly, the beam landing on an old trunk pushed against the far wall. The lid was locked, but something inside scratched feebly, like nails on wood. Panicking, Sarah stumbled back up the stairs and slammed the door shut, the noises growing faint behind her. The next morning, she confronted Dale, demanding answers. Reluctantly, he admitted that local lore spoke of a girl who had worked as a servant for the Kellers. She had gone missing under mysterious circumstances when Helen was a child. Some claimed she'd run away, but others whispered she'd been buried somewhere on the property. Sarah didn't return to Ivy Green after that. Her thesis remained unfinished, and she avoided discussions about her experience. But she never stopped wondering about the girl in the cellar or why the messages stopped after that night. Years later, when Ivy Green underwent renovations, workers uncovered human remains beneath the floorboards of the parlor. The bones were never identified, but rumors spread like wildfire. Was it the missing servant, or someone else tied to the Keller family's complicated past? To this day, visitors report hearing faint tapping noises in Helen's bedroom and glimpsing shadows in the hallways. Some even claim to feel an icy hand brush against their shoulder in the parlor. Ivy Green may be a beacon of hope and history, but it holds secrets. And those secrets have a voice. One that whispers in the night, begging to be heard. Sarah tried to move on with her life, but Ivy Green wouldn't let her go. The sounds, the scratches, the message etched in her memory, they were all too vivid. She began dreaming about the cellar, the dark, suffocating space, and the sensation of nails clawing against wood. It felt as though the house itself was calling her back. Months later, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old, sepia-toned photograph of a young girl, no older than 13, standing on the porch of Ivy Green. Her face was partially obscured by shadow, but her eyes seemed fixed directly on the camera. On the back, someone had scrawled a name in faded ink. Esther. Sarah's stomach churned. This had to be the girl Dale had mentioned, the servant who disappeared. But who had sent the photo? And why now? The envelope also contained a note, hastily written in uneven handwriting. They never let her leave. Against her better judgment, Sarah decided to return to Ivy Green. She called Dale and asked for one last visit, claiming she needed additional research for her thesis. His hesitation was palpable, but he eventually agreed with one condition. He would accompany her the entire time. When she arrived, the house felt different. The air was heavier, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching. Dale met her at the door, his usual easy demeanor replaced by a tense silence. "What are you hoping to find?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think Esther does." Dale's face darkened. "You shouldn't speak her name here." As they walked through the house, Sarah felt a strange pull toward a small side room she hadn't explored during her last visit. It was sparsely furnished, a single rocking chair, a few shelves of dusty books, and a large antique mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was ornate, its gilded frame covered in delicate carvings of ivy and roses. But the glass itself was clouded, as if something had been smeared across it. Sarah reached out to wipe it clean, and as her hand brushed the surface, she felt an electric jolt, sharp and cold. "Don't touch that," Dale barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "What's wrong with it?" Sarah asked, rubbing her hand. Dale hesitated. "That mirror's been here since Helen's time. Some say, strange things happen when you look into it too long." Before Sarah could respond, a faint creak echoed through the room. The rocking chair, untouched, began to sway gently. Dale turned pale. "We need to leave this room. Now." Ignoring Dale's warning, Sarah stepped closer to the mirror. For a moment, she saw only her reflection, distorted by the fogged glass. But as she stared, the image shifted. The room behind her faded, replaced by a dimly lit version of the same space, its walls bare and crumbling. In the reflection, a young girl appeared, her hair tangled, her dress torn. She stood just behind Sarah, her face streaked with dirt and her eyes wide with fear. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. "What did you see?" Dale demanded, his voice trembling. "Esther," Sarah whispered. Dale cursed under his breath. "You've stirred something. We have to leave the house." But Sarah wasn't ready to leave. Something in the mirror had caught her attention, a faint glimmer, as if the surface was rippling like water. Before she could stop herself, she reached out again. This time, her fingers sank into the glass as though it were liquid. A rush of cold air enveloped her, and the room around her dissolved into darkness. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the side room. She stood in a long, dimly lit hallway she didn't recognize. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their subjects' faces blurred and unidentifiable. The air was thick with the scent of decay. "Dale," she called, her voice echoing eerily. No response. A door at the end of the hallway creaked open slowly, revealing a flickering light within. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something, a faint, childlike sob, drew her forward. As she stepped into the room, she realized it was a nursery. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a small bed sat against the far wall. But the bed was empty, its covers pulled back as though someone had just risen from it. On the wall above the bed, scratched deep into the plaster, were the words, "She is still here." The sobbing grew louder, coming from a wardrobe in the corner of the room. The door was slightly ajar, darkness spilling out like a living thing. Sarah reached for the handle, her hand shaking uncontrollably. As she pulled it open, a rush of cold air knocked her backward, and the sobbing stopped abruptly. Inside the wardrobe was nothing but shadows, and yet, Sarah felt something watching her. A whisper filled the room, faint but unmistakable. It was a girl's voice, hoarse and desperate. "Help me." Sarah's heart raced. "Esther." The voice didn't answer, but the shadows in the wardrobe began to shift, forming the outline of a small figure. The shape reached toward Sarah, its hand stretching out from the darkness. Before Sarah could react, the floor beneath her gave way, and she plunged into blackness, the girl's voice echoing in her ears. "Find me before they do. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Sarah hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of earth and mildew was overpowering. She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight flickering weakly. It cast uneven beams of light across what appeared to be a long, narrow tunnel carved into the earth. Above her, there was no sign of the room she had fallen from, only solid, impenetrable darkness. "Dale," she called again, her voice shaking. No answer. Instead, a faint scraping noise echoed from somewhere deep within the tunnel. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragging along stone. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned her flashlight toward the sound. First, she saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, a figure emerged. It was the girl from the mirror, Esther. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her movements slow and jerky, as if she were being forced forward by some unseen hand. Her lips moved, but the words were barely audible. "Find the truth before it finds you." Before Sarah could respond, Esther's form flickered like a faulty projection and vanished, leaving only the scraping noise behind. With no other options, Sarah began moving cautiously down the tunnel. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing against her like a living entity. The flashlight's beam danced across strange markings etched into the dirt, symbols she didn't recognize, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when she looked too long. The tunnel twisted sharply, and Sarah nearly tripped over something buried in the dirt. She knelt down, brushing away the soil, and froze. It was a rusted locket, its delicate chain tangled around a small, cracked bone. Her breath hitched as she opened the locket, revealing a tiny photograph inside. It was the same image she'd received in the mail. Esther on the porch of ivy green, her shadowed eyes staring straight ahead. A gust of icy wind rushed past her, carrying with it a whisper. "Don't trust them." The tunnel ended abruptly at a heavy wooden door, its surface warped and splintered with age. Carved into the wood were more of the strange symbols, their jagged lines cutting deep into the grain. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, but as Sarah reached for it, the lock crumbled into dust. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to turn back. But the whispers had grown louder, a cacophony of desperate voices urging her forward. Inside, the room was small and suffocating, its walls lined with rotting shelves that held fragments of broken pottery, faded books, and what looked like children's toys. In the center of the room stood a low table. On it was an old leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a single name, James Keller. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were unmistakable. She knew too much. She had to be silenced. But she won't stay quiet. Not even now. Sarah's vision blurred as the whispers grew deafening. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, the voices overlapping in a chaotic, anguished chorus. She stumbled back, her foot catching on something soft. She turned the flashlight downward and screamed. A small, skeletal figure lay curled beneath the table, its empty eye sockets staring upward. Around its neck hung a piece of frayed ribbon, identical to the one Esther wore in her photograph. The room plunged into darkness as Sarah's flashlight flickered and died. She fumbled for her phone, but the cold was so intense now that her fingers refused to cooperate. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Sarah spun toward the door, but it had vanished, replaced by solid earth. She was trapped. The growling grew louder, closer, vibrating through the air. A single voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "You shouldn't have come back." A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by another, and another. Sarah backed against the wall, her pulse racing as shadows began to emerge from the void, their twisted forms stretching and shifting. At their center was a towering figure, its outline barely human, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It spoke, its voice a guttural rasp. "She is ours. You cannot save her." The shadows surged forward, and Sarah screamed as icy hands closed around her wrists, pulling her into the darkness. When Sarah awoke, she was lying on the front lawn of Ivy Green, the sun glaring down at her. Dale was kneeling beside her, his face pale and drawn. "You've been gone for 3 days," he said, his voice trembling. "What?" Sarah croaked, her throat dry. "We've been searching everywhere. The police were about to call it off." "Where were you?" Sarah tried to answer, but her memories were fractured, like shards of a broken mirror. She remembered the tunnel, the journal, the skeletal figure, but everything after that was a blur of shadows and whispers. As Dale helped her to her feet, she noticed something clenched in her hand. It was the rusted locket. She opened it again, expecting to see Esther's photograph. But the image was gone. In its place was a single word, scratched into the metal. "Run." Sarah's gaze drifted back to the house. For the first time, she noticed something in one of the upstairs windows, a figure watching her. It was a girl, her face half hidden in shadow, her eyes dark and unblinking. When Sarah blinked, the figure was gone. But the message was clear. Ivy Green wasn't done with her yet. Sarah couldn't leave Ivy Green, not with everything unanswered. Dale begged her to let it go, but the locket's warning, "Run," felt more like a challenge than a plea. Whatever secrets lay beneath the house had been buried too long, and Sarah was determined to uncover them. That night, she returned alone, armed with a stronger flashlight and a resolve she wasn't sure was bravery or recklessness. As soon as she stepped inside, the house seemed to react. The air grew heavy, the walls groaned, and a low hum resonated through the floors. She followed the faint sound of whispers, which led her to the side room, the one with the cursed mirror. This time, the mirror's surface was crystal clear. Her own reflection stared back, but the room behind her wasn't the one she stood in. It was the tunnel, its walls trembling with movement. Sarah pressed her hand to the glass, and without hesitation, it pulled her through. She found herself back in the narrow tunnel, but this time, the growling had stopped. The air was deathly still. Ahead of her, the wooden door she'd seen before was wide open, and faint light spilled out. Inside, she found the journal again, lying open to a page she hadn't read before. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared as if written in terror. "Esther knew what we'd done. She heard us bury her in the cellar, but she didn't die. The house keeps her alive, angry, and waiting. If you hear her whispers, it's already too late." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Behind her, the faint sound of scraping began again. She turned slowly. There, standing in the doorway, was Esther. But she wasn't the frail, spectral figure Sarah had seen before. This Esther was solid, her face twisted in rage, her hands outstretched. Her voice filled the room, sharp and accusing. You came for the truth. Now you'll stay with it. The shadows surged forward, and Sarah felt herself pulled to the ground. Cold, damp earth pressed against her skin, and she realized with growing horror where she was. The cellar Dale had warned her about. As she struggled, her flashlight fell, illuminating the walls. They were covered in scratch marks, layer upon layer, as though someone had spent decades trying to claw their way out. Sarah screamed, but the earth began to close in around her. When Dale returned to Ivy Green, he found the house eerily quiet. Sarah's car was parked out front, but there was no sign of her inside. The police searched the grounds, but their efforts uncovered nothing until they opened the old cellar. Inside, they found a journal and a single locket lying in the dirt. But there was no sign of Sarah. Locals say her screams can still be heard on quiet nights, echoing through the walls of Ivy Green. Some believe the house finally claimed her, just as it did Esther. Others whisper that Sarah never left at all. And in the mirror, visitors swear they can see two figures, now one small, one older, both watching, both waiting, their eyes dark with secrets that should have stayed buried. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.